expedient. I think overall, we're going to have to account where this money went to, because after all, the people whose money it was, the taxpayers, get to vote in a few years, and they'll remind us of what we did with their money.
Nariman, it's not just about some of the issues we've talked about. One of the key issues is about regulation, capping executive pay, which really pulls at the fundamental chords of a capitalistic society. And oh, by the way, talks about capital adequacy, about banks having to keep a certain level of funds on the books. These are two things that could damage the economy greatly. How does the President of the United States stand in front of Sarkozy and Merkel and go toe-to-toe with them on this issue?
Well, you know, very good question. And I'm not really a believer in more regulation, in the sense that it wasn't the lack of regulations that got us in trouble. It was the lack of enforcement of regulations that got us into trouble. So layering on more regulations that in the end are going to be circumvented and not enforced very well is not the answer. I think we need simple, smart regulations that focus on the incentives in the financial system. I mean, I think we all agree that the incentives are completely skewed. Focus on that, focus on transparency, but not necessarily more regulation. I don't think that's what we're talking about here. If you look at who got in trouble, it was the big regulated banks that got into the biggest trouble. It wasn't the hedge funds. It wasn't private equity. So I don't think more regulation is the answer here.
Brian, where do you stand on this?
Yeah, Alexis, that's a trick on the part of the French to get the East Asian banks and the American banks to be overregulated. I mean, the banking industry fled Europe because of the overregulation there, and now they're trying to compensate for that by conning the Americans and the East Asians into adopting their overregulated system, and nobody's going to buy it in Pittsburgh.
Okay, but Brian, in fairness, Germany right now, and I mean, I believe it's Germany and France right now, they're recovering at a faster rate than the United States is, so we certainly have our share of problems here.
Hey, you're right, Alexis, and you know what? The United States is trying to con them into something. The United States is trying to say, why don't you capitalize your banks more? Well, they don't need to capitalize their banks more because their banks didn't fail so much. And so the Europeans are justly complaining, why would you enforce this onerous regulation on us?
So where does
Alexis, if I could just, I just jump in here for a second? One of the sort of silent stories here is the big trouble that German banks are in. In fact, German banks are in very serious trouble, not because they indulged in subprime loans, but they indulged in loans to emerging Europe, to you know, the Baltic states, Ukraine, Russia, all of which are in serious trouble. So German banks actually are in some serious trouble. So there is this sort of myth almost that the German banks are sounder than ours. That's not really true.
Nariman, you raise a great point, though, and that is talk about the IMF and the countries that do have a surplus giving more money to developing countries. How big an issue is that in this G20?
I think it is a big issue in the sense that you are seeing a number of countries, China, of course, being at the forefront, rising in economic clout in terms of size of economy, in terms of their foreign exchange reserves. We have to recognize that in terms of their voting power in places like the IMF. I mean, I think that's the world we're in right now. We're not in the world of 30, 40 years ago when these voting sort of blocks were set. That has to change. Congressman,
last word here. What do we need to accomplish to claim some degree of victory?
Well, I think that we've got to sort of get back to the basics, that we can't just throw money at all the problems. There's a lot of reforms and things we need to do. As pointed out, it was more of an enforcement. Don't overreact. Don't think that just by throwing more regulations and more spending on top of something that it will work out. And I think we got a dirty little secret that we're not talking about. As we go through this crisis, remember that we're treating a lot of symptoms. This country has not had a viable energy policy for over 40 years. You're still going to need that dirty little concept that you got to have energy to run a modern economy. And overall, that shift of resources and wealth across international lines in massive, fast motion does cause destabilizing situations. So as we talk about capital flow and regulation, let's remember we need to be able to have products produced, and with those comes the fact of cost-effective, clean energy, and that means using the energy we have in the ground, but also developing the future resources.
All right. Congressman, I know you're going to stick around and be with us later in the hour. Nariman and Brian, thank you very much, gentlemen. Excellent conversation. Coming up after giving up on the bad bet, that was Skype, is eBay looking to unload yet another high-profile division. Our tech news is next.
For 3 days only at